Yes.
Okay, so good morning. Thanks for having me at this conference. My name is Roberto. I come from Italy and I'm a medical student. Today I'm going to talk about a project that I've been studying during this last month, both at university and both with an organization called the Marble Space Institute of Science. And this presentation is about what are the main clinical problems that we can have with the thyroid gland while we are planning a crewed space mission, especially when it comes to hyperspace. So especially in this period that we are looking at future missions, for example, for Mars. And we have to take into consideration that we have, for example, greater risks like space radiation. So just a little introduction about the thyroid gland in general. As you can see, the thyroid is a gland that belongs to the endocrine system that is positioned in the neck. It is under the larynx and it is anterior to the trachea. And it is composed by these two lobes that are connected at the center thanks to this structure that is called the isthmus. And when we look at the thyroid gland under a microscope, we can see that we have these circular shapes that are called folliculi. And the cells that made up these folliculi are called follicular cells and are responsible for the synthesis of an important substance that is called the thyroid hormone, which has lots of implications when it comes to the human physiology. For example, let's see some of the most important functions about the thyroid hormones. For example, we can see that they are strictly involved in the wakefulness and alertness, because in fact it has been demonstrated that a lack of thyroid hormone in childness, so when we see that children have thyroid hormones, they don't develop in the same way the nervous system. Also, we can see that they are very important in the cardiovascular system because, for example, the erythrocytes can be improved when it comes to their synthesis in an indirect way because the thyroid hormones improve the absorption of folates and B12, that is an important vitamin for the creation of new blood cells. And also we can see that it increases the bit rate and also the strength of this bit. So it is very important for the coordination of the whole cardiovascular system. Now we are going to analyze the three most important things that can impair the function of thyroid when it comes to a space mission. The first one is iodine. Why? Because it is an element that has been introduced in many space missions. In particular, iodine has been introduced in space mission after an incident that happened during the Gemini mission in 1966, because scientists discovered that the onboard water became contaminated with different bacteria. And for this reason, iodine was introduced as a biocide in order to prevent the growth of these bacterial populations. As you can see, we have some important values here that have been described by the Food and Agriculture Organization, that is a branch of the World Health Organization. And it says which is the dose of iodine that we should take every day. And you can see that it is a bit higher in men rather than women. Also here on the right of the slide, I put a little explanation of the physiology of the gland. So let's suppose that in our body, the thyroid hormone is going to decrease. When it decreases, we can see that the adenohypophysis tends to create more thyroid stimulating hormone that acts on the thyroid, and the thyroid that is stimulated manages to create other thyroid hormones. So this is this circle that is called, in fact, a feedback. Also here, I've taken this very good image from this article that explains how thyroid hormone is created starting from scratch, so the iodine that is absorbed with our diets. First of all, the iodine that we introduce arrives in the blood vessels and it is translated into the follicular cell that we have seen before in the circular shapes thanks to this protein. The second passage is the creation of the protein substrate of this hormone that is done by some organelles present in the cell. And you can see that at the center of the round shapes that we have seen before in folliculae, we have the peroxidase that manages to introduce the iodine into the protein substrate, and it leads to the creation of a mature thyroid hormone. Then the process goes backwards, because once we have the creation of the mature thyroid hormones, it goes back inside, and at the end, these hormones are released into the bloodstream, and they link to these two important proteins that are called the thyroid-binding prealbumin and the thyroid-binding albumin. Why did I expose this process? Because the impairment with the iodine excess is linked to this process. For example, this is here in the top left is an important article that explains what happens on astronauts when there is an excess of iodine. These scientists made an important discovery. They introduced particular filters on space shuttles, and also another study put it on the International Space Station. And as you can see, at the beginning, before the experiment, the quantity of iodine was 4 milligrams per liter, while after the introduction of the filter, it was 0.25 milligrams per liter. And making a comparative study, they discovered that crewmates before the introduction of this reduction in the iodine quantity had a higher quantity of thyroid-stimulating hormone in their plasma. And if you remember the scheme that I showed you before, when there is a higher quantity of the thyroid-stimulating hormone, it means that there is a reduction in the quantity of thyroid hormones. And a reduction in thyroid hormones, it means that the thyroid isn't working properly. Now, there are many theories behind why this happens. And the most credited one that is also has been studied by many scientists is the Wolff cycle effect. It says that when we get too much iodine inside us, the thyroid temporarily doesn't work. It shuts down. And in fact, it is believed that is caused by the creation of these particular substances called iodolipids and iodolactones that block the peroxidase that we have seen here, that is fundamental in order to put the iodine on the protein substrate in order to create the final thyroid hormone. Also, let's just make a quick follow-up of what we can do about this problem of iodine excess when it comes to iodinated water that we have on board. The water at the moment on the International Space Station has a concentration of 0.17 milligrams per liter. And making a simple calculation with the maximum dose that is half a liter, we can see that the maximum quantity of water that we can drink with this concentration of iodine is almost 3 liters per day. But when we look at the normal quantity that an average person has to drink, we can see that 3 liters is less than the recommended dose for men, while it is almost the same for women. So what can we do in order to plan better future mission from a dietary point of view? Men can have problems, especially when it comes to long-term missions, because if we want to prevent iodine excess, we have to drink less than what is recommended. And this can be a problem, especially, why did I put especially in outer space? Because crewmates have to be more interested in what happens in the thyroid in outer space, because while on the International Space Station, we are partially protected by the geomagnetic field, and so the radiation is partially diverted. When it comes to outer space, we aren't protected by this kind of radiation. And for this reason, the effect of iodine, as you can see after in the other slides, can be more dangerous. In women, since we are at a level where we are reaching the maximum dose, it's better to avoid food that has a lot of iodine inside in order to let them drink the recommended dose of water. Then the second point, we are moving to microgravity. Microgravity is something that we must experience during space missions, and it impairs lots of cells, especially when it comes to experiments that have been conducted in laboratories. And it is because a lot of our cells have a particular property that is called mechanotransduction. It says that we have some mechanical inputs and they are converting to biochemical outputs. As you can see, one of the most important features is the destruction of the cytoskeleton that is, in fact, dysregulated because there isn't the presence of a weight. And many experiments have been conducted in simulated and real microgravity. In simulated microgravity, thyroid cells have been grown, both healthy cells and cancer cells. Healthy thyroid cells, as you can see, showed apoptosis. It means that most of the cells that belong to the thyroid tend to die. And it means that the thyroid is not going to work properly. While cancer cells have demonstrated to generate these 3D spheroids that are a most common feature of thyroid cancer cells that are cultivated in the microgravity. While the most important and the most interesting feature about microgravity and thyroid is what happened during real experiments. As you can see, there have been many missions about the study of the thyroid and its interaction with microgravity. The first one was the Texas 44, where there was this cell culture that is a thyroid cancer cell. And as you can see, there is a reduction in the quantity of receptors for the TSH. And what it means? It means that the adenohypophysis synthesizes the stimulating hormone, but the thyroid doesn't respond. So it is like a form of impairment. At the same time, we have other experiments that are more recent, like, for example, the Eneida and Desperia, where we have 2 Italian astronauts, but also another Japanese mission, the Shenzhou 8, where we have an exploration of what happens to other types of cancer cells. And it has been demonstrated that they tend to die as the healthy cells that we have seen before, but also they become less aggressive when it comes, for example, to metastasis, to the development, so the growth rate. And it is a very important feature when it comes to scientific research. In fact, what can be done when it comes to the interaction between thyroid and microgravity? For normal thyroids, we can't do anything, also because it's difficult to simulate a normal gravity while we are not on the Earth. So we are subjected to microgravity anyway, and the thyroid is going to be exposed to a major rate of apoptosis. While it can be interesting for scientific purposes, because it has been demonstrated that microgravity can affect the phenotype of cancer cells, and for this reason, it can be considered a viable way to conduce cancer therapy. Now let's move to the third and last paragraph about this presentation, that is interaction between the thyroid cancer and ionizing radiation. I took this image from this article because it's very simple to understand. We are in space, imagine that we are astronauts and we are bombarded from every direction with space radiation. And they can be very dangerous because we are talking about high energy radiation. And it has been demonstrated that thyroid is a very radiosensible organ, but there are some characteristics that can improve this sensibility, especially the age and the gender. In fact, children are more affected by the exposure to ionizing radiation, and also women tend to be weaker when it comes to the exposure to ionizing radiation and the effect of the radiation on thyroid cells. Also, as you can see, we have very low doses, and they are able to cause very big problems to the thyroid. So where does the knowledge that we have today come from? It comes from past accidents, especially Hiroshima and Chernobyl, that are 2 most important events. As you can see, there are some differences in the features, because with Hiroshima we have a burst of gamma rays, while in Chernobyl we have also radioactive iodine that is very dangerous, as I was saying before. And in both cases, it has been demonstrated that there was a significant rise in the number of people that developed thyroid cancer. And the demonstration was that a lot of them, in fact, you can see that were younger than 20 years old. That intensifies the fact that age is a very important parameter when it comes to the sensibility to ionizing radiation. Today, we know that ionizing radiation can cause very important problems to DNA inside the thyroid cells, because in fact it is linked to the onset of particular forms of thyroid cancer. These are the two most important features, and also the two most common, that are the RET PTC and the BRAF-AK9, that belong to the same metabolic pathway, and both of them lead to the proliferation of thyroid cancer cells. The chromosome is bombarded with ionizing radiation. There is a breaking in the double strands, and these structures tend to be inverted. So it's called, I think that this one is a translocation. So a piece of DNA goes into another region of the DNA, while here we have an inversion. So this structure is broken down. It makes a 180 degrees turn, and it is reinserted into the same structure. And it leads to the activation of these cells that tend to proliferate and so become cancerous. This is an interesting fact that I announced before, that was taking into account the quantity of iodine when we are in outer space, because there is a higher quantity of ionizing radiation. Because, as you can see, this is a medical study, and dentistry, something related to dentistry, and they say that the use of the united contrast with CT increases the radiation absorbed by the thyroid. What it means, the united contrast can be the iodine that we are assuming with the water on board, while the radiation is something that we can find in space. So translating this information in what happens in astronauts during outer space missions, more iodine plus more radiation, because we're in outer space, it leads to an absorbed radiation dose that is bound to increase. And this means increased cancer risk. So we can find some interaction between the different features that we can find during a typical space mission. Last but not least, what can be done about the ionizing radiation? As you can see, the iodine intake, as we have seen in the previous slide, may interfere and increase the absorbed radiation dose. But also dentistry can help us developing new strategies, because we can't do anything for radiation once it has reached our body. But what we can do is creating new strategies of shielding, so new shielding strategies. And this one is used commonly in dentistry because it's called a thyroid collar. It has a thin layer of lid inside, and it protects the thyroid from the exposure to ionizing radiation. So implementing new formal strategies like this one can surely help people to develop new strategies to reduce the impact of ionizing radiation on thyroid during space mission. So with this slide, I have concluded, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for your presentation. Really is amazing work. Congratulations. We have time for 3 questions. Marcelo from Argentina. The abnormal functioning of the thyroid gland by space exposure can be medicated?
Well, it depends on what we are talking about, because as we have seen, there are many factors that can impair the thyroid. When it comes to the iodine excess, yes, in most cases, the impairment due to iodine excess is temporary. So once we stop the absorption of iodine, the thyroid becomes again normal. When it comes to the microgravity, sadly no, because once the cell undergoes apoptosis, it can't be recreated because we don't have such a proliferative rate inside the thyroid. And space radiation is the worst of all, because it doesn't only prevent the creation of new cells, but induces the creation of tumors, of cancers. So when it comes to iodine, yes, it is a reversible condition. Once we stop drinking iodine and eating it, we can go back to a normal situation. Microgravity, no. The less we stay in space, the less there is an apoptosis of cells. The space radiation is the worst of all because we don't only have a death of cells, but we have the creation of tumors. So this is the three conditions.
But it's specific for each condition, yeah?
Sorry?
It's specific for each condition.
Yes, yes. Also, there aren't studies at the moment that study the interaction between these three space factors. So it will be interesting to see new research in this direction, you know, to say if we put iodine excess and space radiation, what happens? Or for example, if we put a microgravity iodine excess, what happens? Because it hasn't been done before and it's really very interesting to know about this.
Okay, thank you, Roberto.
Thanks.
Carolina from Colombia, Manizales City. The question is, what is the principal reason for the space environment to affect the thyroid?
Again, if we are talking about space environment in general, what I have shown you today is just a little part of what happens in outer space. The thyroid is bound to be affected by the space environment because it is projected as an anatomical feature to stay on Earth. So we are created to stay on Earth, even though we are looking for outer space. So the microgravity, for example, is an important feature because, as I told before, there is this property, this mechanotransduction, that gives the cell the feeling of the gravity. So it knows what is the direction. So once we have a long stay in weightlessness because we are in the outer space, far away from the Earth, it's difficult for the cell to orientate themselves. And in fact, they lose the cytoskeleton. This is just a little feature, but also the space radiation. As you can see, there is a very strong connection between the space radiation in the outer space and what happened during Hiroshima and Chernobyl, that are sure not safe environments for people. So if you compare those kind of radiation to what happens to astronauts that are in the outer space, you can surely imagine what is the impact of this kind of radiation on the thyroid.
Okay, Roberto, the last question. Is possible to apply the same protocol, microgravity, for example, when you have cancer, but without not space condition? I mean, no exposure to space condition. Is possible to apply the same protocol to repair the DNA, for example? This question is for Diego from Ecuador.
Okay, so if I have understood correctly the question, can we simulate in laboratory a process where this cancer cells are subjected to what?
Yes, different conditions to space.
Okay. Cancer cells have already been explored. For example, the article that I showed you before in the presentation already studied that once we put thyroid cancer cells under microgravity condition, they tend to switch to a less aggressive phenotype. So it means that, for example, if we had a metastatic tumor that could potentially reach other sites in our body, it doesn't do that. So it becomes, let's say, more friendly. And it has been also demonstrated that it responds better to therapeutic treatments. Microgravity, yes, it has been done only with thyroid cells. It has been done with other kind of cell culture, for example, breast cancer, or also some kinds of brain cancer. So we take these cell cultures, we put them, the cheapest way is doing this in laboratory because otherwise we need space missions, so for example, gliders, parabolic flights. And we use, for example, clinostats. The 3D clinostats, we induce this rotation that simulates an effect of microgravity. And then different parameters are studied, like, for example, the proliferative rate, the grade of apoptosis, and it has been demonstrated that also other kind of cancer cell cultures respond in this way. Iodine excess, I think that nothing has been done on laboratory level, because there are many comparative studies like the last one that I showed you. So we take people that drink a big quantity of iodine, people that drink less iodine, then we take blood samples, we extract the plasma, and we measure the quantity of TSH. So it is kind of indirect diagnosis that we do. So this is maybe something that lacks in the modern literature when it comes to these kind of experimental setups.
Roberto, is there any possibility that apoptosis maybe low in these conditions?
Sorry, I don't know if it's my problem.
Change the apoptosis and...
No, sorry. I hear you lagging. I don't hear your voice properly. It's like it's lagging the connection.
Yes, I have a problem with the storm here. Is there any possibility the apoptosis low in this condition?
No, no. Neither in three of these conditions, it's always bound to increase. Space radiation destroys the cell completely or turns them into cancerous cells. The microgravity absolutely destroys the cells, and the iodine excess, if we don't shut it down in a time frame, it doesn't become a transient condition, but it can become a permanent condition that can lead to hypothyroidism. And so many cells, even though they are there and they don't undergo apoptosis, they are not going to work.
Okay, thank you so much, Roberto. It's all. Congratulations again.
Thanks.
Greetings from Colombia.
Greetings from Italy.
Scientific community, you are welcome. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.